안녕하세요. 역사는 미래를 밝혀주는 등불이라고 합니다. 역사를 통해 다가오는 미래를 예측하고 어떻게 대응해야 할지 판단하고 선제 대응을 할 수 있기 때문이죠. 그러므로 우리는 역사를 배워야 합니다. 이러한 역사관은 저명한 대학교 교수들도 동의하고 있습니다. 특히 한 외국인 교수는 우리 한민족의 역사에 대해 연구하였는데요. 그는 바로 예일대학교 아른의 베스타 교수라고 합니다. 그는 한국과 중국의 역사에 대해 연구하였습니다. 특히 우리나라와 중국의 관계 그리고 우리나라가 중국의 속국에 되지 않은 이유에 대해서 말이죠. 자세한 내용은 영상으로 보시겠습니다.
And our guest is Arn Westad. He is a scholar of modern, international, and global history with a specialization in the history of Eastern Asia since the 18th century. Today we'll talk with him about his forthcoming book, Empire and Righteous Nation, 600 Years of China-Korea Relations. So let's begin with an overview of the book. Tell us about it.
So this is a book that started as a set of lectures that I gave at Harvard 2 years ago, where I tried to provide an overview of the relationship between China and Korea over a long period of time, to sort of try to get to the essence of what that relationship is like. So it started very much from the idea of the centrality, the significance of that particular relationship today. I think whatever happens in the future, relations between China and Korea are going to be pretty important for the international community. And then I developed it from there. So this was actually a case of working backwards in history. So starting with my interest in the contemporary relationship and then working back. And it ended up being a book much more about history than about the contemporary situation. But hopefully, you know, it will be an opportunity to learn from that past.
Why Korea and China? What led you to focus on that relationship?
So two things really. I mean, one I mentioned already. It's the contemporary significance of that. So that was one starting point for this. And of course, China is by far the most significant neighbor of Korea. But then there was also a preoccupation with how this has worked through history. So Korea is a small country, bordering a country that for most of its existence has been an empire, China in its various imperial incarnations. And I was quite eager to try to find out a bit more about how that relationship had worked. So for instance, why was Korea never incorporated into the Chinese empire? Why was it always distinct? Why did it have a very clear, specific identification of being outside of the empire? That's an interesting question, I think, in the broad sense.
Okay, and so when you gave your presentations, your lectures in China and Korea, and also when you were doing the research in general, did you come across anything, were you asked anything that surprised you, that you didn't expect?
Oh, a lot. I mean, I think particularly surprising perhaps today, I mean, when you think about the relationship now between China and Korea, is the mutual preoccupation that people from these two countries have of each other. So China being a big country, a bit like the United States, right? You ask people about relations with other countries, and it's, you know, it's somewhere there, but it's not central to their heart. It's not part of the core identity of who they are. For many Chinese, Korea is a little bit different because it has been a neighbor for China for millennia. It is so close that young Chinese now who watch South Korean television series of various sorts, their reaction is, these people are foreign, but they're almost like us.
Right?
And that preoccupation, I think, was a bit surprising to me, how close that relationship is seen as being. And
so why do you think that China never brought them into the fold of their empire?
So I think there are two main reasons why it never happened. The first one, which I explore in the book, is the development of what you could, with a slightly anachronistic term, call Korean nationalism. At least from the late 16th century, there is a very clear Korean identity, which is connected to the culture as it had developed during the Ming in China, but is still separate from it. And it comes pretty close, I argue, building on the work of historians of Korea that have worked on this before, very close to what in the 19th century and early 20th century in Europe you would call a nation. That's quite unique in many ways, but that identity is important. And then secondly, I think on the Ming side and later on Qing Empire that took over from the Ming in the early 17th century, there was this idea of Korea as a symbolic ally, as a model ally in a way, and therefore had to some extent earned the right to be separate from it. It didn't have to be disciplined. It didn't have to be brought into the empire and told by the emperor, stop misbehaving, live like us, because in a way they already did that.
Right. Was there a certain level of respect, do you think,
Yeah.
between the two countries?
I think there was a great deal of respect. Now, of course, on the Korean side, on the Joseon side, one always had to be very careful. Living next to an empire is always difficult and sometimes very dangerous. And I think the Korean leaders during the Joseon state developed a number of ideas about how they could handle that relationship with the Chinese empires, with the Ming and later on the Qing. Always be respectful, but also always be very cautious with regard to how you dealt with the empire next door. For instance, the Koreans became masters of knowing much more about the empire than the empire knew about them.
Wow.
They were extremely good at taking advantage of the ritual visits that they carried out, the so-called tribute missions, to Beijing, figuring out what was important for the empire, what was discussed there. They were, you could put it in modern terms, you could say they were really good at intelligence work. And all of this was reported back to Korea, and therefore the Korean kings knew how to react when different kinds of initiatives came out of the Chinese side.
Is there anything over the course of the 600 years that we've learned through history that can help with today's situation, do you think?
I mean, first and foremost, the understanding, as we've touched upon already, of just how hard it is to live next door to one of the world's megastates, especially as China rises in terms of international affairs and become more significant on a global scale. They have to figure out, how do we deal with that relationship? How do we deal with it in terms of the economic aspects, the political aspects, the military strategic aspects, or even the cultural aspects.
Sure.
And on this, I think there is a great deal of learning that can be had from history.
And thank you so much for being here with us today.
아른의 베스타 교수의 말을 요약하자면 다음과 같습니다. 첫째, 16세기 말부터 우리 민족은 한국인이라는 정체성을 아주 뚜렷하게 갖고 있었다. 명나라와 연결성은 있었지만 독자적인 문화가 뛰어났다. 이런 정체성은 19에서 20세기 유럽에서 발전한 제국주의 개념과 아주 흡사하였다. 정체성이 아주 뚜렷하였기에 우리나라를 정복할 엄두를 내지 못하였다. 둘째, 중국은 우리나라를 동맹 국가의 대표 모델로 여겼습니다. 단순한 동맹을 넘어 명령을 할 필요가 없었습니다. 우리나라를 존중하였습니다. 특히 중국이 우리나라를 존중하게 된 이유에 대해서 자세히 설명하는데요. 이는 우리 민족의 정보 능력이 뛰어났기 때문으로 분석합니다. 교수는 우리나라가 제국에 대해 달인이 되었다. 자기 나라보다 더 잘 아는 수준이었다. 중국 황제가 무엇을 중요시하는지, 어떤 안건을 토의하는지를 낱낱이 투입하고 이를 한국으로 즉시 전송해 우리나라의 정부가 어떻게 대처해야 할지 바로바로 판단할 수 있었다. 즉, 기밀 정보 업무에 상당히 뛰어났다. 고 밝혔습니다. 마지막으로 예일대학교 교수의 말처럼 우리는 정보전에 뛰어나고 정체성이 뚜렷한 민족입니다. 과거 우리나라의 강점을 현대에서도 발휘하여 세계 최강국이 되는 그날을 기원합니다. 영상이 도움되셨다면 좋아요와 구독, 댓글을 부탁드립니다. 감사합니다.